because of it. Well, ahlan wa sahlan al-kull. I'm very happy on behalf of the Middle East Institute of the National University of Singapore to welcome everybody to a kind of serendipitous, fortuitous gathering of like-minded scholars to address in the most informal way the issue of the interconnectedness or the lack of interconnectedness of the Arab world and the Middle East as it is traditionally understood with Asia as it is traditionally understood. It's a serendipitous, fortuitous kind of get-together because our institute quite independently has been planning a workshop that will take place tomorrow afternoon, in which we will be investigating succession and secession. The issue of succession in Egypt following the latest parliamentary elections. And we've invited a very distinguished Egyptian political scientist known to many of you, Professor Mustafa Kamal Sayyid, to join us for that. We had hoped actually that he would join us for this meeting, but there has been a bit of a delay in his travel plan from Cairo, so he won't be arriving until tonight. But those of you at the Inter-Asian Conference hopefully will have a chance to meet him at your closing dinner tomorrow. But our other speaker in this double header of political crises in the northeast part of the Middle East is Dr. Ahmed Abu Shouk, who I think is quite well known to many of our colleagues in the Asian field because he typifies and exemplifies a certain connectedness between the traditional Middle East, and of course our Middle East starts at the Atlantic Ocean and goes all the way across northern Africa. Dr. Abu Shouk is from Sudan. He has been teaching, though, at the International Islamic University in Kuala Lumpur. He comes to us a bit jet-lagged because he is just a couple of days ago arrived from Sudan, where he's been conducting research. So our institute's program tomorrow, which I think many of our other colleagues won't be able to attend, is going to be looking at the secession issue in Sudan, a referendum that may or may not happen next month and could lead to fairly major consequences, while Dr. Mustafa Kamal will be telling us about what the recent parliamentary elections in Egypt really mean and what that means for the succession issue in Egypt when a presidential election of some description is scheduled to take place next year. So we were enthusiastically working on this program when we learned, to our great pleasure, from Sedan Ishami that the Social Science Research Council and the Asia Research Institute here, which is the most, I would say, grounded, productive, and elaborate and scholarly of the research institutes in the U.S. that deal with area issues, we're putting on the second edition of this Inter-Asian conference. And so when Stephanie got in touch with me and asked if we could suggest some participants from the Middle East, the Asian part, or perhaps the African part even of the Middle East, because there have not been a substantial representation apparently in this among those who have applied for this conference. We suggested some names, but more importantly, we were very happy at her suggestion that they allow some of the Middle Eastern participants in the Inter-Asian Conference to come over here this afternoon and talk a little bit on the question, bringing the Arab region into Asia, conceptual frameworks and empirical challenges. So what I would like to do, without further discussion, is ask Stephanie to talk a little bit about their conference and their short-term and long-term research agenda. And then we have asked 3 of the participants in that conference to make some comments. And we have also asked Dr. Abushuk on very short notice if he too could make some comments. So let me turn it over then to Stephanie, and then we'll open up for what I think will be an informal but hopefully interesting discussion. And I should say, in addition, I welcome all of the other members and friends and colleagues that we have invited. So I'll pass this to you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to the Middle East Institute at NUS for hosting us and for enabling this discussion, which can only be very preliminary and hopefully the beginning of an ongoing conversation. So I'll explain a bit more, as Michael suggested, how this has come about. Well, there's a rather long story of the Inter-Asia Initiative at the Social Science Research Council, which I will only go over briefly. And then I will elaborate a little bit more about my particular interest in bringing the Middle East, actually, but in this case I'll explain why the framework is Arab region, but into an Inter-Asia framework. Actually, interestingly, the idea of having a project called Inter-Asian Connections was first suggested at the SSRC at the Middle East Advisory Panel. So at that time we had advisory panels for each of the world regions. And I was directing both the Middle East program and the Eurasia program, the post-Soviet sort of program at that time, which I did until recently. Actually, I just handed it over last year. So. And it was very interesting to me to be directing 2 different world regions and to see how the scholarly communities understood region very differently, and the kinds of themes and topics that they suggested for research and for conferences, for grants, fellowships, and so on. And the Middle East panel that I had put together suggested 5 themes, and one of them was Inter-Asian connections. And it was not coincidental that the person who suggested it was Professor Khaldoun al-Naqib from Kuwait University. So, I mean, I think for all of them, all those living in the Gulf, academics or non-academics, and maybe even more for the non-academics, it's obvious that sort of through the Gulf flows all these Asian networks and connections and processes and flows and so on. And I love the idea. We usually, what we did in those cases is we'd start with a small planning meeting. And so I organized one with my colleague who was running the South Asia program and the Southeast Asia program. And that was very rich, and we came up with a lot of themes, but we couldn't find any funding. So the funding world always seems to be lagging behind a little bit in the really exciting sort of frontiers of academia and research. 10 years later, the funding seems to be coming into place. And so I'm really happy, but it shows sort of the long gestation of this idea. So in 2008, we organized a conference called Inter-Asian Connections in Dubai. And for me, it was very obvious that it should be somewhere in the Gulf. Dubai suggested itself for many reasons. It was in the boom time. It was before the Arab Fall. We had a completely open call for papers because we didn't know how many people would respond to the idea of like Inter-Asian connections. And the response was overwhelming. We got something like 800 proposals, for papers and workshops and this and that and so on. So the conference in Dubai was about 150 people, And it was a bit messy organizationally. It was a little bit in terms of you know, the inner workings of the conference. You know, it was difficult to sort of handle a conference of that size. But in general, there was a great deal of excitement, I think, and a lot of discovery, which is what one sort of hopes for, actually, in academic conversations, is that spark of recognition where you don't expect recognition. Right? And after the conference, Professor Dwara was our keynote speaker, and he and I and one other participant from Hong Kong University, Helen Su, who's Hong Kong and Yale University at the same time, talked about trying to make this a more ongoing series of conferences. So here we are at the second one 2 years later, which seems to be going well by all accounts. Smaller, we scaled it down to half the size. We didn't have, here's Professor Su, our third partner from Hong Kong University. We scaled down the number of workshops to 5 from 11, and we suggested themes as a way of controlling the large numbers of proposals. We still got overwhelming responses. What was interesting, and this is what leads me now to today's, or this panel's conversation, is whereas in Dubai we had a fairly healthy set of applicants from the Arab region, or scholars who work on the Arab region. For this conference, we really had very, very few. Now, the thing is, it's a very competitive process, because first the workshops are competitively selected, and then the participants in the workshops are competitively selected. But even you know, before the competition, so it's not just the competition is weeding out these people. The applications were not there, very few. Turkey has always, scholars from Turkey have applied always in healthy numbers. Now, the social science community, the humanities community is more robust in Turkey than in many of the Arab countries, but I think it's more about imagination and ability to imagine yourself sort of as part of Asia. And I think for many Turkish scholars, you know, being called Asia Minor, having an origin myth as, you know, hordes rising in from Central Asia or from Inner Asia, you know, the idea of being somehow part of Asia comes more naturally than for Arabs. But, I mean, it's interesting that it may not come very naturally to scholars in the Arab region. Why does it not occur to scholars who study the Arab region from outside the Arab region? So there's equally sort of a sort of I don't know what, a disengagement. I mean, it has never come up somehow, or it's not a matter of a bias, it's not a matter of blind spot, it's not a matter of you know, not wanting to. It's just something that has never occurred to anyone to think of their work. There are exceptions, of course, and there have been, and it's building up. The scholarship on the Hadrami communities has been building up for some time, and in, you know, in the context of Indian Ocean research. There's also work. There's also some work, some people, some individuals who are working on things like Malaysian students at Al-Azhar University, who are looking at urban formations like Singapore, like consumption spaces in Singapore, and how it affects the planning of consumption spaces in Cairo, or you know, Dubai and Singapore kind of competing in terms of cityscapes and things like that. So there's beginnings of these kinds of individual types of scholarship, which I think, if we gave it a little bit of a push, incentives, grants, research grants, conference sort of settings and so on, could be profitably sort of expanded. Now, what I want to emphasize is that by saying, you know, bring the Arab region to Asia, let's think of most of the Arab regions, West Asia, you know, let's think of West Asia, let's use the label West Asia. This is not at all to negate or to replace other frameworks. It's not to say let's not use Arab world anymore, or let's not use Middle East anymore, or let's not use some of the emerging frameworks that are, Mediterranean, which emerged some time ago, or Euro-Arab, which is now becoming very popular as a kind of a North and South Mediterranean. It's not at all to say, because I think it would negate the very spirit of this enterprise, to say, there's one framework through which you have to look at a territory. The idea is, do we gain something empirically, conceptually, in terms of our research imaginations, by remembering that West Asia is the west of Asia, and not just part of the Arab region, part of the Middle East. And so what does it open up? Maybe it also closes certain kinds of inquiries, and we should be cognizant of that as well. Now, I mean, one of the problems, and this is in the recurrent discussions about area studies and so on, is that instead of topics suggesting geographies, often geographies suggest topics in the world of scholarship. And this is also what we're trying to get away from. The theme should suggest the geographical extension of the research being undertaken, rather than, I do Middle East, therefore there's like 5 main areas of research, Islam, gender, conflict, weak states, authoritarian states, etc. But it's easy to say, but difficult to actually implement, because if you want community, if you want support for your work, especially as a younger scholar, you have to fit yourself into a scholarly community. And so it's easy to say to a student, go forth and strike boldly, do things no one is really doing, learn 3 languages, and do multi-local research and so on. You need to support these students to be able to do those sorts of things. So these are real challenges in asking people to sort of go beyond what is the customary and usual. Now, for scholars in the region, often their work is on their own countries, and they very rarely engage in comparative work. I don't know if that's true of here as well. I mean, North African scholars do have a tradition of doing Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, sort of comparisons. I think I don't know in the Gulf if there's a beginning, because there's a sort of a Gulf social science community now forming, like an association forming. People usually do their own country. And the worst is when they then generalize to the Arab world from their own country. And so I think helping people to think comparatively outside the Arab region also kind of enables them to put their work on their own country in some kind of perspective. But now, I mean, just as a final set of thoughts, again, I mean, I just want to emphasize, we want all this work, to continue, to expand and so on. Arab world, Middle East, Mediterranean, Euro-Arab, whatever, Arabian studies, Gulf studies, etc. I think they're all good. They're all good as long as they're helping promote good, critical, solid research. As long as it's enabling scholars to meet one another and to exchange the work, and that the exchanges are not only, Lebanon and France, or Egypt and the US, that those are not the only connections that are being forged for scholarly work, that there's also sort of, I mean, it's very hard to get Turkish and Arab scholars to work together, for example, collaboratively on a project. So the more the better, sort of, is my approach. But I'd like to suggest a few advantages that a look from West Asia across this region may offer. One is, I think it offers a very different linkage between history and the contemporary. when you're looking at history and contemporary social formations or political formations, say, you know, in Syria, and you're thinking about it in terms of Ottoman Empire and, you know, the sort of the traditional way you think of kind of historical evolution in the area, then when you think of sort of the whole of Asia being involved in the history of that place, it enables you to delink and not to fall into the trap of projecting backwards from your national, from your nation state. I think it's hard to do, but you know, I think this is really a productive way of doing that. Secondly, when you look from West Asia to East Asia, the Gulf becomes central. It doesn't become the periphery of the Arab world, which no one cares about, but they are forced to think about because they have all the money now, and you know, you resent them, and you know, but they're the periphery, and you know, the center of Arab civilization is in the middle and not there. They become absolutely central to this Asian connections theme, and I think that is only for the benefit of all. Thirdly, completely neglect topics about financial and cultural flows, contemporary financial and cultural flows, from the popularity of Indian films to real estate investments that China is making in the Middle East and so on. All these things which are not being studied, I mean, as far as I know, so categorically, but
not yet.
As far as I know, are not being studied, you know. Immediately suggest themselves. I was probably reading my own handwriting, but okay. And finally, and maybe a little bit romantically, it's looking from West Asia to East Asia helps us to recall common histories of anti-colonial struggle and post-independence collaborations and alignments, from the non-aligned movement to, you know, young Egyptian and Indian students in Paris and London working together in their anti-British struggles and so on. Also histories which, there is work on that, there is some good work on that, but, you know, again, is not. So this is actually something we were talking about in the conference, that looking at how nation-state formation itself was a transnational process, and often a trans-Asian process in that moment of history. So I think I'll stop there. And just say the hopes of sort of emerging from this conversation with some concrete ideas that we can take to our next conference, which will be in Hong Kong in June 2012. So the sort of representation of Arab scholars was so weak in this conference that, and this now explains the Arab rather than Middle East, is that Ford Foundation Cairo, I persuaded Ford Foundation Cairo to give us a small grant. And their parameter was Arab and not Middle East. So, which is fine also, I mean, to invite selected scholars from the Arab region to come as auditors in the conference, hoping that they may get inspired, they may inspire their colleagues, they know about the Hong Kong conference ahead of time, and we may begin to sort of build up momentum that will begin to carry into the next conference, as simply as that. So please, as they present, don't be unfair, I mean, each of the people I invited responded extremely enthusiastically, but they haven't had much time to digest, right, or to think, or to somehow begin to imagine what the possibilities might be. So this is their first attempt to articulate some of this, but you know, I know them all, and I know they have no problems articulating. So.
Well, thank you very much, Seton. If it's any indication of good things to come, I should just mention that as we began to develop the Middle East Institute here and put out recruitment calls, we were not sure at the beginning whether we could attract anybody interested in the Middle East to Singapore, which seemed like it's pretty far away from everywhere, from a certain perspective. But it turned out, in fact, we're still sorting through the applications, but I would guess we have over 70 applications for positions ranging from senior to junior research fellows to short-term researchers to postdoctoral fellows. It's quite overwhelming, and a certain number actually do address this question of interconnectedness from one perspective or another. So we take that to be a good sign. Before I turn the meeting over to our four speakers, could I just ask everybody around the room just briefly to introduce yourself, because I don't know that everybody knows everybody else. But if we could start perhaps with Camille.
Hello, my name is Camille Germanos. I come from Lebanon. And I am about to work with the Middle East Institute as a research associate on my own country, Lebanon. But I've been writing a PhD at a French university about the divided cities in the Balkans.
My name is Jackie Armino. I teach in international affairs at Cutler University. I've been living in the Gulf now for 7 years, but I've also lived in China for 7 years. I was a workshop leader for the first one in Dubai, and now I'm a participant. And although my field is generally Islam in China, so I've been doing Middle East and Chinese studies since I was a graduate student, actually since I was undergrad. But so for me, this is like, but it's true. I mean, this all along until very recently, people have looked at me like, what? You do Chinese and why? So normally I do Islam in the Middle East, and then I did something on how Chinese Muslims go overseas to study in different centers of Islam learning around the world, and then the connection they meet with other Muslims from other countries. But for this workshop, I looked at what I called Silk Road Redos. I didn't have no idea you did that. The title of your article. But basically how there's now large numbers of Arabs who are going to Yiwu, which is a city south of Shanghai, and they've set up, a community for themselves. So, like it was during the Tang Dynasty, where you have immigrant community traders who are basically settling down. You now have once again. So that's what I presented this time.
Hi, my name is Nida Abradi. I'm from Saudi Arabia. I work at the Saudi Embassy at the Political Affairs. I used to work here in the Middle East for a short time. I also studied in NTU, my master's in strategic studies, and worked in the research institute there in SRC School in the security studies.
I'm Prasenjit Dwara. I think most of the guests know who I am, but I'm the Director of Research in Humanities and Social Sciences. What you may not know is that my work, although I'm originally from India, I spent time, but I work on China and Japan and Asia in general.
My name is Ellen C. I'm professor of anthropology at Yale University. And for the last 35 years, I've worked on China. In the 70s, I was in the villages. In the 80s, I was in the booming market town. In the 90s, I followed the 100 million people into the cities. And today, I follow the entrepreneurs, the Chinese entrepreneurs, in Southeast Asia, basically Middle East and Africa. So, 10 years ago, I set up this Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences at Hong Kong University with the idea that we would like to pursue not only a East Asia agenda, but very much an inter-Asia or Asian connections agenda. And sort of linked up in the Dubai conference, and I was much inspired. And so here we are. We presented very, very open for decades, and of course, so we are very interested in bringing our China colleagues to the Middle East and through the Middle East into North Africa, and at the same time to bring our colleagues there to China. You mentioned Yiwu. I was just with my African colleagues from Yale. We visited Guangzhou and Yiwu in China, the two of the most important concentration of Arab traders and African traders in China. And we would love to find partners Asia and North America to make a difference.
I'm Ginger Elville. I work with I'm a research analyst over at SSRC School of International Studies. I'm working on my master's towards international relations, and before coming out here, I was working in Iraq as part of the rehabilitation center out there.
I'm Iftikhar Bashir. I'm a senior analyst at SSRC School of International Studies.
I'm Michael Feeder. I'm right here at NUS, both in this very office, in the Asia Research Institute and the History Department. And like Jackie, I've got this sort of dual training since graduate school, really working on both Southeast Asia and the Middle East and back and forth. My training was really old school. My main work is really on Islamic law. But just last year I published a volume. It's called Islamic Connections, Studies of Muslim South and Southeast Asia. This is really talking about precisely the ways in which these two very large parts of the Muslim world grew up in interaction with each other. And what I really tried to do there was to develop a kind of a new model that tried to change the kind of supply side vision of Islamic history that we tend to work with, right? You bundle it all from the Middle East and then you send it for export. And trying instead to develop this new vision of how, as the Muslim world expands, bits of elements from the frontier get folded back into the Islamic world. We have this sort of ongoing sort of creativity of building up Islamic civilizations. I can talk a lot about that later if you'd like, but the idea is to try to not only bring the two regions together, but to think of a kind of more dynamic model of how they work, rather than just sort of prepackaged Islam for export.
I'm Faisal. I'm in the Institute of Policy Studies. I was from the South Asian Studies Department for 9 years. I crossed over this year. The interest then was to look at the business and trade linkages between South and Southeast Asia. My current work actually looks at state-led development and human capital flows between the two regions. Before leaving the South Asian Studies Department, I actually want to look at the link between South Asia and the Middle East in terms of human capital flows. So maybe that thing was put on the back burner because my work actually has to look at more on Singapore and Southeast Asian focused issues. So maybe a project to look at human capital flows between Singapore or the ASEAN region and the Middle East and the Gulf states if there's possible. Thanks.
I'm Ataur Rahman. I'm a senior visiting research fellow at the Middle East Institute. I look at now and studying the cultural, social and political context of leadership and governance in Asia and now focusing on the Middle East. So, and also the interconnectedness among the various sub-regions of Asia and how the issues really are now converging in a sense into one type, one model where we can see interconnected much deeper so that it can be more fruitful. So that's the contextualizing the various issues in the context of Asia and the Middle East.
My name is Nasir Tamara. I'm a senior research fellow at RE here, originally from Indonesia. Used to be editor of Islamic newspaper in Indonesia called Republika Jamhuriyah. And now, in the past, I have worked on other country in the Middle East that has not been mentioned, Iran. I wrote 2 books on Iran, and also I did some research in the Middle East, in Palestine and Israel as well. I tried to use that in Indonesia, but had problem when I wrote about Israel. A lot of demonstration would come. And my interest now is to continue to work on Islam in Southeast Asia. I'm going to give a paper next Monday on this religious terrorism in contemporary Indonesia, the Malaysian connection, trying to look at the 2 countries, Malaysia and Indonesia. And I would like to continue to work on Islam, its relationship with, of course, what you call it, West Asia, very important. And I really appreciate very much the idea of establishing a center of West Asia or Middle Eastern studies at NUS. I will be teaching at the University of Gajah Mada in Yogyakarta. The subject would be religion and pluralism.
Yeah, my name is Gabriele Maranci, and at the moment I'm at the Department of Sociology at US. I hold an honorary position at Cardiff University at the Centre for Studies of Muslim in UK. I'm the founding editor of Contemporary Islam, Dynamics of Muslim Life. There's a new journals, and we are quite keen to also develop on this, and there's a bit of focus at the moment on Southeast Asia. Depends if you follow the topic, tend to follow my kind of pilgrimage around the world, and I'm also founded the editor with Brian Tanner to the new book series of called Muslim in Global Society, and also has published some books recently about Southeast Asia, but I will be very keen to find more about connections between the two. About comparatives, I cannot agree more on what you said. First, as a student, I suffered terribly because I actually followed your path that you were speaking about. And after, as younger senior scholars, actually had a problem following exactly that kind of path. Exactly of this kind of structure, but you start to break the structure. You don't have an area of reference. You define yourself as an anthropologist, but anthropology work in villages, anthropology work in the sector, you know, this kind of stereotypes things that you find yourself, in particular if you work first in community of the Middle East in Europe, you become quite, so migrants and diaspora there. So after more and more I was interested in contemporary, in kind of comparative studies, exactly because I've probably been very lucky in moving quite a lot along the line. So definitely this is something I would suggest that also it's not only Southeast Asia and the Middle East, but today we have to consider also the context of Europe, European countries, and the two migrations coming and meeting there. You go to London, Manchester, so on. There's a lot of interlink. It's Asia and Middle East meeting as postgraduate students, have new associations, religious movements and connections, in particular Muslim Brotherhood. So that is an area that could be very new and fertile, and I'm quite keen to explore.
So my name is Terry Norton. I'm a political science professor at NUS, where I've been for about 5 years. I'm head of the political science department. I work in fields of political theory, political philosophy, and international relations, and the connection between the two. And I guess my connection with this closest research connection would be that I'm very interested in broadening the definition of political theory so that it's not so Eurocentric. I've worked with others on this project. We call it deparochialization. And the question is how to do this, and it obviously goes beyond sticking some Eastern text into a Western canon. You have to completely reframe and rethink the whole thing. And I'm trying to actually build this up as one of the foci of the political science department.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like also to ask my three colleagues on the MEI team if they would briefly introduce themselves, starting with Ramel.
Hi, I'm Ramel. I'm the technical support for MEI.
Hi, I'm Mary. I'm organizing all of the events, and I hope one day to follow all of you into this field as well.
Hi, I'm Brenna. I work at MEI with Dr. Hudson as his assistant. I was his research assistant at Georgetown doing my master's in Arab Studies until he pulled me away to Singapore.
Thank you. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to our four distinguished speakers. You have their bios in your little program, so I won't elaborate further. And I'll start, as I think we have listed them in the program, with Dr. Sarah Hanafi.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Just a few words. I'm associate professor of sociology at American University of Beirut, and I started as a sociologist of migration. I mean, interested in Palestinian refugees, and then moved to study the refugee camps as a space of exception, following Giorgio Agamben formulation of the politics as a state of exception. And so I work mainly in Palestinian territories, but also in other sites, recently in Lebanon, in camps as space of exception. And I work, so moving from refugee camps to study the whole occupied Palestinian territories as a spaces of exception. So I published a book with two Israeli colleagues, Adi Ophir and Michal Giovanni, a book called The Power of Inclusive Exclusion, Autonomy of the Palestinian, Autonomy of the Israeli Rules in the occupied Palestinian territories. So long. And then moving to Beirut 5 years ago, I wanted to experiment to look to biopolitics, governmentalities, and state of exception in the Arab world. So I convened a workshop, and we had a very interesting scholarship from Tunisia, from Morocco, from Syria, from thinking the technology of powers in the Arab world, if you like. So it's not as occupied authority, but the regime, the Arab regime, as authoritarian regime, but looking to how these regimes instigated their citizens, and then look to the resistance of civil society to this spaces of exception. So this is how I can formulate it in a few words, my work. And then in the last year, I moved to think the university systems in the Arab East, Mashriq al-Arabi, and the elite formation. So I was intrigued by the Lebanese cases, that I noticed that you have many elites. They don't converse with each other. They didn't meet. There is no point of encounters. It's not only, I'm not talking here about sectarian community, Christian, Muslim, but Francophone, English speaker, Arab speakers, and then I found it the same problem, but less acute in other places, like in Gulf, in Jordan a little bit, between national university versus other universities, and quickly I realized that we have two elites: those who publish globally and perish locally, and those who publish locally and perished locally, globally. Sorry. So there is, for instance, just an example to bring. I looked to the annual report of my faculty of Art and Science at the American University of Beirut. I found 272 publications last year among faculties. Only 3 articles written in Arabic, and 2 books. One of them is mine. So just to show that how much is this faculty is disconnected from their environment, because we lie if we believe that in al-Mashriq al-Arabi people speak English or French. I mean, this is really a thin layer of the society. So I realized that we have a structural problem of dependency here, center periphery, but we have optional structures that people decided that, and of course the university play this game also, that there is promotion system where you should publish, etc. So so from here maybe I will move to talk about the importance of connecting South-South relationship before talking about Asia. I think we keep talking about shy away from universalism of science, or hegemonic science, but develop something like multiversalism, but in opposition to universalism. But we don't do sufficiently work to dig into what we have locally and how we will bring it. It's not Occidentalism to response to Orientalism. It's not a vindictive enterprise. It's just to promote more case study at the expense of macro explanatory causal schema of understanding phenomena we find it in our society, etc. So I think this is why I think it's very difficult to promote that if I am in France, okay? So I think this exercise of promoting local should be done in a meso level with going in India, in Singapore, and exchange this local, this regional connectivity and so on. Now, these days in Beirut, you have two research committee meeting, and I am a member of these two research committees. An Institute of Palestine Studies, so they have a meeting today, started, and Center of Arab Unity Studies. And both, when I apologized by email saying I cannot attend, they told me, but can you bring some connection from Singapore? We are, so I think this is, it means that there is that the Arab world, I would say, are very interested in this connection to South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. It's a joke if I say that my three best Indian scholars with whom I converse, I knew them where? In Israel, not in the space where you have anti-Zionists, and not in the Arab world. So I've never seen in the last 5-6 workshops, not last, I would say more 10 in the Arab world, I've never seen an Indian, Malaysian, Singaporean, etc., etc. So I think there is something maybe we should work on it. And just maybe to finish, I think 10 minutes, my 10 minutes is over. I am the editor of Arab Journal of Sociology, إضافات المجلة العربية لعلم الاجتماع. And I took the initiative and I translated Farid Attas. And you know he's from Sayyid Farid Attas.
And we're sorry he's not here.
Yeah.
Where is he? He's missing.
One of the overseas.
So about his very interesting article in the alternative discourses. This was published maybe 6 months ago or more, and this is the article where I have the most hit, and because this is a hard copy and also an internet. So this maybe indicators about the willing of having this again this exchange between the two regions. Okay.
thank you very much. Well, we know all of those institutions in Beirut very well, and we will do our best to see if we can develop some connections from Singapore and Southeast Asia. Can we turn now, please, to Dr. Abdulaziz Azalawi?
When Satani told me that we'll be expected to talk here and give a presentation about how Asia enters into our work and so on, I panicked. It doesn't enter in my work. It didn't enter in my work so far. On the other hand, a few weeks earlier, when Satani also asked me if I would come here, I jumped on the opportunity because it came at a time when I was telling myself, isn't it time now to start looking into that part of the world? So it is very timely. It is a timely invitation. It has been an eye-opener as a conference. It's timely for me personally because next year I'm starting what might become a 2-year sabbatical, and I'm now considering ways to use it, initiatives to develop, and so on. But because it's so premature to propose specific ways into which Asia can enter into my personal work or a specific initiative can be formulated, perhaps the way I'd like to use my own time is to bring you into what I do and then ask you the question. If you can suggest means or ideas through which I can become part of this very important work indeed. I'd like to focus on the work I've been recently doing in the past 7 years as founding director of the Economic and Business History Research Center at the AUC. But in order to do this, I have to take a couple of steps backwards. Earlier than that, there is a continuum which I think I've been following. I started my working life as a banker for 14 years. And I was a corporate finance banker and a sovereign debt banker. A few years after that, when I saw the light, or when I missed the way, I don't know how to put it, I decided to switch to academia, and I started this at the very late age of 39. It was an extremely interesting experience in itself. But I took something with me from banking. I took an interest in studying elite capital societies and ideas for economic nationalism. In Egypt, we have a certain folklore that says, the first expression of economic nationalism in Egypt was through a man called Talat Harb, who founded the first Egyptian National Bank. And I simply couldn't buy the idea. I thought that buying it would simply be accepting the logic that Egyptians were dumb enough not to realize the importance of starting an Egyptian National Bank earlier than that. Harb was the first person to found the bank. Founding the bank is one thing, and conceiving of the idea is another. And what I was strongly suspecting was that he couldn't have been the first person to think of the idea for many reasons. Egypt had been exposed to international banking for many years before Talat Harb. Egypt has been through a heavy debt crisis 80 years before Harb, 40 years before Harb. There has been a significant accumulation of capital by the private sector or by private capital owners in Cairo, in Egypt, and all this would suggest that Egyptians they've been cotton exporters. It's logical to expect them to want to aspire to take a greater share in the market. All this would suggest that Egyptians must have realized the importance of having a bank of their own. This is what I actually focused on in my own work, my own dissertation, and not surprisingly, I did find out that 40 years before Harb, the first idea for establishing an Egyptian National Bank was sounded, formulated, conceived of, and proposed to the public, and it was frustrated because of the collapse, not of the popular Arabi Revolution, which was a bit later, but collapse of the elite movement at that time led by Sharif Pasha. It's an entire project, but getting into it, I had to raise questions about how Egyptians became familiar with modern banking there was some sort of banking in Egypt before that, but what was modern banking for Egyptians? How did the idea of joint stock come to Egypt? Their encounters with banking as an institution, their encounter with business modernity as a concept and how it entered into the productive activities like applying steam engine and cotton ginning. How the arrival of joint stock international banks in Egypt was part of a massive movement of capital export from Europe. How the entire movement by economic elites in Egypt was part of a political assertion, of an attempt to assert themselves politically vis-à-vis central authority on the one hand and vis-à-vis the European powers on the other, and so on and so forth. The end result of this is that I found out that business history was a very useful way to studying social history and to contextualize it within a global flow of capital, of commodities, and of ideas. We usually celebrate and study the arrival of ideas on the more absolute level, perhaps on the political level, on the level of general liberal thought, but with respect to economic ideas, we didn't do this enough. So I started believing that business history is indeed a very ripe field for development. And I started strongly developing an enthusiasm that we should consider seriously establishing a business history center at the American University in Cairo. By that time, I was already back in Egypt, and I was director of the Middle East Studies Center there during that period of time. I started discussing the idea with some scholar friends. Interestingly, the move towards establishing the center came as a result of a small roundtable meeting at UPenn, which included 5 of us basically. There was Roger Owen, Bob Vitalis, Bob Tigner, and Alice Goldberg, leading scholars in the economic history of the region. They all subscribed to the idea, and we decided to start it as a grassroots initiative at AUC, which actually, and this is the model, I don't know, perhaps that can be repeated, which actually mobilized support from these scholars, interested scholars, and universities, and brought it to AUC rather than the other way around. We began by having a pilot project for a few months. Our immediate objective was to form a repository of documents that are unavailable in the public domain, thinking that this would create opportunities for research. And we focused on 2 types of documents: private papers and oral narratives. Of course, oral narratives create a constraint with respect to the period we can cover. But you may know that Egypt is a place where records do not exist easily. When they exist, they are not accessed easily. When they are accessed, they may be suffering from self-censorship, etc. We thought that...
We wait for WikiLeaks.
It didn't exist at that time. We thought that the contribution we can have is to start compiling the narratives of figures who played different roles in decision-making in Egypt. And from January 2004 to June 2004, we compiled narratives of all living ministers of industry at that moment of time, and then took a step forward by, after compiling their narratives, by putting them together in a room. The 4 founding fathers of the center came, and there was a 3rd constituency, fresh graduates and senior undergraduate students in AUC, who were they had promising academic caliber, and there were very little opportunities for academic employment. So they got involved in this project. And there you were having, in a single room, in a space, combination of former senior public officials, senior scholars, and young scholars, aspiring scholars, talking to each other. This alone produced another kind of narrative. Okay? So you had the oral narratives and you had this interactive sessions. The oral records and the meetings, which from there on became an annual forum we held May of each year. Last May we had the 7th annual forum. Next May we'll have the 8th annual forum, mainly composing of narrative sessions in addition to young scholars research. These became the two first products of the center. But they gave rise immediately to material for a third product, the Chronicles, which is a magazine produced by the young scholars of the center. Okay? Eventually, this also gave rise to a fourth product, which was panels put together, young scholars panels, totally young scholars, going to Mesa to present. And I think this was the first time for AUC to send undergraduate students and fresh graduates. They are not graduate students yet, they are just fresh graduates, to Mesa. We began by sending one panel, then two panels, and these were chaired by people like Bob Tigner, by Bob Vitalis, Roger, and so on, which created another dimension. You had those young scholars in constant communication with their references overseas and so on. The fifth product came when we compiled enough narratives to have seeds for teaching material. And I started from there on to teach a selected topics course, which is exclusively based on the material we gather. I actually tell my students when we begin the course, we leave the theory by the door. We will borrow from it and we will call it whenever we feel it can be useful in reflecting on the material, but not the other way around. So we ended up now having oral narratives, annual forum, chronicles, panels, and teaching material. Very clearly, one item is missing, research. Okay? Which was, for me personally, a dilemma. And running the center, and at one time combining with it running the economics department as well, and teaching left very little time for research. The material itself is loaded with clues that cannot be found otherwise. And I can elaborate on this in the Q&A if you want. Among most things that you can easily find are details on informal dynamics of decision making in Egypt. Not the things that you will find directly in the documents, but the things that happen behind the curtain, not the decision itself, but how it was taken. And right now, we've reached the point where the center is finishing the 7th year of existence. We just got reviewed, and it was a positive review. I finally got emancipated. I'm handing over the center to someone else, and I'm getting my time free to develop the different things in the material. And I'm also starting to think of what exciting projects can one start from there on. So this is what I've been doing so far. And I leave it to you to perhaps make suggestions, give guidance as to how can this be developed with Asia in it. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Sami Atallah.
Well, thank you for having us here. I just want to spend maybe a few minutes introducing myself, and because I sort of wear two hats. The first hat that I've been wearing for the last maybe 10 years or more is pretty much working in the policy sphere in Lebanon. Particularly started working in a research center called Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, doing some work as an economist on decentralization issues, municipal finance, budget issues, competitiveness of Lebanese firms, all focusing on Lebanon, some work on the Arab world, but mostly really working on Lebanon. And after that, actually, after 3 years of sort of doing that work, I was tempted or asked to join a minister who was chairing or was the chairman of the center to go with him and work with him at the ministry. I was actually tempted not because I want to work with a politician. I always thought that there are weird creatures that I'm not really interested in mingling with. But nevertheless, I thought it would be really an opportunity to actually see how actually things work from the inside, you know, particularly from a research perspective. So I sort of did a tour, I would say, working for several ministries in Lebanon. One is industry, finance for some time. And a colleague of mine at one point said, Sami, you cannot refuse working on these policy issues, because if you, particularly on those, we're talking about municipal finance, because if you're not going to work on municipal finance, you know, since you've been working on it for some time, so who would? Now, funny enough, this colleague of mine is now the Minister of Interior, and I was asked to actually do the policy recommendations for his ministry. So now I'm sort of putting him to a test to see actually whether the policies that we're recommending actually will be possibly adopted or implemented. But moving away from the sort of the policy sphere, the economics, Lebanon per se, I decided to wear another hat, and which is pursuing my PhD back in 2006 in actually politics at NYU. So that took me out of Lebanon for some time. And I spent a few years in New York, and one of the things or areas that I got interested in was sort of the oil countries and this oil curse literature and so forth. And through my work on that, I was a bit puzzled by Kuwait, particularly, just to maybe zoom in. Because sort of you have two sort of competing theories. One, the modernization theory, talks about, you know, the richer you are, the more educated you are, the more likely you have democracy. No matter how you want to define democracy, whether it's elections or parliamentary institutions or what have you. So these countries, the Gulf countries, the 6 GCC, only Kuwait had a parliament. So and if you look at the resource curse literature, says that if you're actually rich in oil, then you should not have any form of sort of democracy or political institutions that actually allows, you know, the opposition to share power. So Kuwait sort of was an anomaly for me, and I was sort of trying to dig deeper and understand why is that the case. And through that, actually, I comparing this Kuwait with these other GCC countries, I sort of accidentally fell, or sort of, you know, it made sense to me when I started looking at particularly British India and sort of the effect of the India or the British in India affecting the political institutions in these countries, going back as far back as 1798, when Napoleon invaded Egypt and he started making contact with the Sultan of Oman. He wanted to actually set up a coaling station, which the British read as a major threat to India. And this is when the first sort of deal was sealed between Britain and Oman, which actually said something along the lines that the relationship between Oman and Britain is like the earth and the sun, you know, nothing will break them apart from each other. And sort of that work sort of, and I say accidentally because I never thought, as Satani actually said, the Gulf was always looked at as a periphery of the Arab world, you know, no one really looked at it in terms of a sort of a, you know, a core player. It was at the periphery of the Ottomans, the British, so it fell through the cracks in a way. But when I started looking at it from Bombay and how Bombay saw this part of the world, this part of the world became the Western Hemisphere of British India, and protecting it and influencing it and getting involved as early as 1798 up to essentially 1915, where all sort of deals or agreements were signed between India and these countries. And you see successfully, or in succession in the sense, the first country that falls into this orbit is Oman, the second one is Bahrain, UAE, Sharjah and the Qawasim, and then you move to Qatar, and Kuwait comes very later on. And I was sort of taken by this and saw how this actually affected the political development in these countries. So the sooner Britain got involved in this country, the less likely that democracy was able to actually evolve, because they wanted to support a pliant ruler who would actually quell oppositions and so forth. Kuwait had actually a room to experiment because the ruler could not simply suppress the opposition, the merchants back then, for two good reasons. He didn't have the backing of the British, he didn't really care about him, frankly. And two is the merchants were threatened to leave, so he would lose his economic base. And this had actually forced him to actually negotiate with them, which sort of evolved into a parliament as early as 1938, which, by the way, in 1938 we see the same opposition rising in Dubai and in Bahrain, but fell through because of British intervention. In any case, so this actually sort of threw me off guard, because I never thought really how sort of, British India comes into play, because working or studying Arab history and so forth, we were also confined, particularly to the Ottoman history, to the French mandate, to the English mandate. But now I'm sitting in Bombay or looking at the Gulf, I saw sort of it was a different perspective. So my work now is sort of evolving into sort of two sort of stretches. One is looking at not from West India, now looking at East India, and how sort of the British saw from Calcutta, the world, even to Singapore, which becomes a geostrategic sort of place for the British, the way they saw Oman at one point, and later when the Suez Canal opened up, Egypt becomes a key state, which they were very happy to have the French open it up for them, really. And the other one is actually looking at the Arab world and looking at how it sort of it's no longer sort of the Arab world being, to me at least, from the Atlantic to, depends how you want to define it, to Iran or Pakistan or Afghanistan, somehow the Arab world to me became interconnected between Europe, essentially, and Asia, and how sort of Europeans passing through the Middle East and how they sort of was key to them to control certain areas. I'm talking about really as early as 1800 probably, from the Gulf of Aden, to the Red Sea, to Basra, to Oman, all to protect sort of this trading routes. So I'm kind of now interested in this sort of trading routes, under the British Empire, and how sort of it influenced the political development in these countries. Now, just sort of institutionally, getting out of my research a little bit, I would very much like to sort of, because of this interest of mine, to sort of, support more of this interconnectedness that I see. So, I don't know, on one hand, it's like, yeah, of course, it makes sense, at the end of the day. But I actually would like to sort of, pursue this kind of work. Now in Lebanon just happens to be my hometown, but also my affiliation to the Lebanese Center of Policy Studies, and with the possibility of leading the center at one point, which I could do that, I'd very much like to sort of then use that opportunity to actually sort of bring that work in the Arab world, into Asia, and sort of build on that as part of its sort of research agenda.
Thank you very much. And now, finally, Dr. Ahmed Ibrahim Al-Shouk, our guest for our event tomorrow. He is uniquely qualified to speak here. He is the editor and contributor to a recent book on the Hadrami diaspora in Southeast Asia. So there's a linkage from Arabia to Southeast Asia that he is very much an expert on, in addition to his many other professional interests.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. Let me start my presentation with the opening remark of Stanley Shami regarding how to retool from one area of specialization to another. And it starts that with a short story. After submitting my PhD for examination at the University of Bergen in Norway in 1998, I got a manuscript from Professor Rex Shonofehi, 275 manuscript written in Arabic, and he asked me to read the manuscript carefully and write a short report about the contents and its relation between the Middle East and Southeast Asia. I was a little bit disappointed because the theme of the manuscript at that time was a little bit far from the area of my interest. because the theme of my PhD project was the impact of the British colonialism on the indigenous political institution in Sudan. I took the ordeal, and after finished the reading of the manuscript, I got interested in the manuscript, because the theme of the manuscript about a Muslim scholar who was born in Sudan and he studied in Saudi Arabia for 14 years and established his career as a teacher and Islamic reformer in Indonesia from 1911 until to his death in 1943. This scholar was Ahmed Sokoto. And from that time I got interested in interrelationship between the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And through my research, I figured out that there are 3 areas of interest, or 3 areas that would reflect this kind of interaction in terms of human mobility, idea or intellectual exchange, and the mobility of the commodity in the regions. I figure out that there are 3 interrelated topics or research going on, including the Hadrami communities. And here we have the contribution of Ulrika Vertak, the current director of the Center for Modern Oriental Study in Berlin, and her colleagues from different parts of the world. And the second area is the area of Islah and Tajdeed, to highlight the influence of Muhammad Abdu, Muhammad Rashid Rida, and Jamaluddin al-Afghani in this part of the world, I mean Southeast Asia. In this respect, I did some kind of research on the publication of Al-Mana, and I compiled all the material written about Southeast Asia or the correspondence between Muhammad Rashid Rida and Muslim scholar in Southeast Asia in 2 volumes. A very rich volume about the issue discussed at this part of the world. And the very interesting thing, the influence of the Islah and Tajdeed took its shape in this part of the world before the Middle East. Because the Muslim Brotherhood was established by Sheikh Hassan al-Banna in 1928, right? And Haji Ahmad Dahlan established the Muhammadiyya movement in 1911, and in early 20, he had more than 6 million members. Then here we can see the aspect of interaction. The other area is the issue of the Indian Ocean studies. And this research was established at the University of Peking and developed through some institute in different parts of Europe, and we have a number of researchers, such as Ulrika Vertak and Aziu Mardi and Muhammad Ridwan Osman and the others. I think if we would like to bring the Arab regions into Asia, we should focus on these 3 areas. From my experience at International Islamic University in Malaysia, we succeed in attracting a large number of scholars from Saudi Arabia and the Arab countries when we address the issues on Islam and Muslim world and Muslim community, to address the kind of local and transnational relations between different regions. And I realize that also here we should look at the issue of the language. There is a kind of language barrier. For example, if we have 2 languages, English and Arabic language, we realize that we can attract some scholars from different parts of the Arab world. In terms of networking, I think, for example, in 2005, we established Asian Association of World Historians in Lanka University in 2005, and they are going to have the 2nd conference in Korea in 2011. What we noticed is that we failed to attract a large number of scholars from the Arab world. Then the founding member of this association, Patrick Menon, the director of the World History Association Center in Pittsburgh, suggests to have lecture tour in different parts of the Arab world. Then we suggest the American University and the University of Qatar and University of United Arab Emirates. In recent years, the American administration changed its policy to some extent and established satellite universities in different American universities in different parts of the Arab world, in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, and in Qatar, and so on. Then we can use also the colleagues in this different part of university in order to strengthen the links between Asia and the Arab world. At the level of Southeast Asia, we have a joint project with the Foundation of King Abdulaziz for Research and Archive. They have a huge project financed by the Ministry of Higher Education in Saudi Arabia on encyclopedias. They would like to produce an encyclopedia on Hajj. And Hajj also is one of the attractive issues that we could get more researchers in the field. If we would like to overcome the problems regarding the interrelationship between Southeast Asia or the Arab world and Asia at large, I think also we need to look at the university curriculum, because the university curriculums are very nationalist. They focus on the history or the political science of their own countries and pay less attention to the rest of the world. If we wouldn't be able to overcome this problem, it would be very difficult to attract young scholars to move from the paradigm of their national history and to focus on some kind of interrelation study or comparative study in order to highlight the transnational relationship in terms of historical discourse. In terms of relation between Southeast Asia and North Africa and Southeast Asia, I think International Islamic University in Malaysia is going to have a conference on Islam in Africa, because we feel that there is striking similarities between the process of spread of Islam in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. And we feel that this platform or this topic could attract scholars from different parts of the world in order to highlight the aspect of similarity and difference between the two regions. And as we know that North Africa is a part of the Arab world. When we talk about the Arab world and Middle East and West Asia, these terminologies have their own sensitivities, because I remember that we discussed this issue with the governor of Sharjah. He's a historian by profession, and he doesn't like the idea of Middle East. He said the term Middle East has negative connotations. When we say Middle East, middle from whom? Then we need to overcome this kind of Eurocentric approach in studying the relationship between the two regions, whether we use the Arab world or West Africa or whatever. And thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank all of you very much for all of your interesting comments. I think there are several dimensions and connectivity, and perhaps even some ideas for making these connections more concrete. But in the remaining time that we have, which is about 20 minutes or so, let me open up the floor for reactions to what our four speakers have said. Dr. Eduardo, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is very, we should be very grateful, and we are, to Sejani for bringing this event. This is, I'm fully expecting that this is going to broaden our world and our horizons, and I was very interested to hear all of your positions on your research statements and your positions regarding the expansion of what you called, Dr. Sari, what you called South-South relation. That's another way. There are many ways of thinking of this, and of course, each one is dominant at different times, at different periods, and it would be interesting actually to do a sort of a review and see, you know, what works where and why and so on. And But I wanted to make some comments on, especially since Professor Azal Arab was asking for some, ways in which his ideas and research could plug in. I was thinking about something. And as Sami began to speak, he was almost answering my, he was speaking my position, what I was going to say. So I think this may be something very interesting, and I think we can think of it at different periods, because of course, West Asia, which is the word being used now, has been very historically connected, as Stephanie pointed out, in many different ways to, Jackie can tell us the overland routes very well, into China and Asia and so on, and but we also know the maritime connections and so on. But, I think Sami was pointing very interestingly to the different connections that British colonialism also produced. But and so you have, it seems to me that the ways that we can talk about it are, one, and what we've done in our Inter-Asian conference is, one, to talk about comparisons, the other is connections. And there are both methodological problems of trying to combine the two, but I think they can be done, because after all, what's the point of, how can you compare, what's the validity of comparing something that is connected, right? So there is an issue there. But I want to bring up a third modality, which actually involves both, and which may be very interesting and useful for expanding this mode, and that is what I call convergence. So that you have certain institutions that one can think of it in terms, for the time being at least, as center-periphery kinds of things, but the periphery can rewrite histories also, right? So there are certain processes that begin with colonialism, right? And British Empire, which joins the huge mass of Eurasia, right up to Shanghai. It has, and to Tianjin and so on. It set in force lots of common processes that produced a convergent reaction, so that there was convergence between. So for instance, one of the things I've done some work on is to look at how the British colonial structure reorganized. I haven't really done work, but anyway, I know about the issue. Looked at the Shanghai Maritime Customs. One of the things that they took over was Shanghai Maritime Customs. And their goal was not just to, partly it was to make sure that the Qing dynasty had enough resources to pay their debts to the imperialist powers. But the other thing that they were doing is that they were really trying to create a modern market. They would send out whole legions, armies of people all over China to see what goods were coming from where, to unify currency, to unify weights, measures, standards, standardizing of these markets that was going on everywhere. And they would have reports coming in from all of these places. And what they were doing was that they were creating the infrastructure of a modern market, so that a good coming from Aden or Rio de Janeiro or something could be exchanged relatively transparently in some interior part in Ifu, for instance. They were really going to the... So this is a kind of thing, of course, similar things were happening all over the literal parts of Asia. And then there were reactions also to this. So this is a common process to which you get reactions which allow us to talk in terms of convergence, right? And then you have, and you can almost, if you do a very simple-minded analysis, you can sort of probably see that economic nationalism emerges at the same time in these places in reaction to various kinds of things. Ideas of banks, and everywhere you begin to see very similar developments. And political processes that sort of either push it through because of different circumstances or get it to fail. And everywhere, and then you have independent histories. But they really reacting to a common process. So it seems that, and I think we could do it with Islam, we could do it in an earlier period, we could do it with, capital flows now in the globalization period. And actually we could even do it in the national period to show how and when national banks show up everywhere, right? There is, after all, nationalism is the most fundamental form of globalization. Everybody's adopting the same institutions, right, with their differences. So it seems to me that that was one way that I think we could gradually begin to understand the South-South connections a lot better, and hopefully come up with what several people are trying to also talk about, global theory from the South, you know, in some way, something that sort of modifies our understanding.
The word convergence has a certain resonance with us. We're going to be putting on a major conference here at MEI in May on the Gulf, and the final panel in that conference is called Convergences between Southeast Asia and the Gulf. Now, from a political scientist point of view, there are 3 or 4 dimensions of convergence. Rana and I have just come back from the Manama Dialogue, which is a very high-powered security conference held in Bahrain. The Singaporean Minister of Defense pointed out one of these convergences, which was not the one you would think of. I mean, one point of convergence, of course, is the question of transnational militant Islamist terrorism, which Singapore has an inordinate interest in. But that wasn't actually what the minister was talking about. He said that there might be lessons to be learned from all sides from the regional integration organizational experience of ASEAN and other regional organizations that are growing up here, and the regional organizations that have been perhaps far less successful in the Arab world and the Middle East. So one could think of comparisons and lessons to be learned along those lines. But it's also true that when this particular institute was being established, it was pretty clear that the Singaporean authorities who decided to set it up thought that there was clearly an economic convergence. There was an investment convergence, there was an oil and energy convergence, and so on. And that, of course, is a convergence, I think, that is recognized on both sides of the equation. Clearly, and Professor Narden will, as another political scientist, will know that there is a great interest in governance, and comparisons can be drawn of all kinds between the kinds of authoritarian governance, soft and hard, that you might find in various parts of the Middle East, and the various kinds of governance that you might find in Asia that might in some ways be similar, or maybe not. But I think that there is a broad agenda here to be pursued, and I hope that since there seems to be so much interest now being generated, that we will help do that. I think I saw a hand, did I? Dr. Rahman.
No, because just along pursuing the same cue, I think also the challenges, that how each sub-region deals with particular challenges in terms of democratization, in terms of alternative forms of government, governance, and also in terms of administrative experiences. I think this is very important in the global context, or on some issues like climate change, or climatic issues, or other issues of concerns, economic and global concerns, or regional concerns in Asia. I think how these issue areas or issue arenas can be addressed by the different sub-regions, and there can be convergence, and as well as how to deal with the challenges. I think that may be one area that I would like to highlight.
Yes, please, Jackie.
I'd like to follow up on what Professor Abdul was saying about curriculum, to point out that one of the things I learned, I put together a panel for AAS, which is the Association of Asian Studies, their annual meeting on China and the Gulf. And one paper was by a Chinese student documenting how the spread of Arabic studies programs throughout universities in China. And she had documented quite a lot. There's, I think, 30 universities now which offer classes in Arabic, and a growing number of Middle Eastern research institutes in China. But at the same time, like for example, the UAE has established, I think they've just recently changed the name to the Sheikh Zayed Center for Arabic Islamic Studies at Beijing Foreign Cultures University. But also within the UAE, they've set up a Chinese immersion school. It's a primary school, hoping to eventually be a secondary school. And it's geared towards Emiratis, so that their children from kindergarten basically can be learning Chinese. But at the same time, I mean, like look at Georgetown. I mean, the founding dean of Georgetown in Qatar was a China scholar, and he's gone. And there's nobody there who does China, and apparently no plan to have anybody there do China. I was the only China person in the UAE, and I'm gone, so there's nobody there now. And now I'm at Qatar, I mean, at Qatar University. But I think that it's interesting that it seems like at least the Chinese are being much more active in terms of learning about the Middle East than certainly what I've seen. And I don't know about AUB and AUC, but I'm not sure there are many scholars of China at either of those institutions.
Thank you. Dr. Su?
Very interesting observation. At Yale, actually, the two most popular languages for study, one is Arabic, the other is Chinese. But I'd like to come back
I
to...
would say for bad reason. Maybe both for bad reasons.
No, for us, coming from humanities, I think language is very basic for any kind of understanding. You know, whatever the motivations. Okay. You don't get much noise from a 90-pound girl. No, I was just saying that at Yale, these, the two most popular language classes now are very much Arabic and Chinese. It's very interesting development. I mean, for good reasons or for bad reasons, at least the students will learn the language, and hopefully they will accumulate other things to increase the kind of sensitivity. I think that's very, very important. But coming back to the issue of connectivity, I think our group here, Satani presented and I, are very much trying to create multi-layered platforms for our colleagues from, from the Middle East, from South Asia, from Southeast Asia and East Asia to connect. For us, thinking about connectivity, first we think about the very hard side of it, the infrastructure over land or sea, both historical connectivity and contemporary. And then on the other hand, then once we think about these connections through space, then immediately time gets drawn in. Then we think about connectivity in the age of empires, then in the age of nation states, in the age of neoliberal connections, and now of course in the age of post-socialist transformations. So in a sense, all the kind of movements and flows through space, we have to very much bring in the historians to tell us how these flows are being, connected, in different kind of global context. And then we very much focus on people and institutions because they make those flows. And so we would be looking at particular groups. We think about trading groups in historical times. We think about educators. We think about scribes and merchants and all sorts. So in a sense, again, our topics for our workshops and all that are focusing on different kinds of people, from lineages to traders to politicians to so on. And then, of course, then we look at the institutions they bring, the cultural capital they bring in these kind of movements, and the institutions they built, from lineage halls to temple networks to, from religion to all sorts of government forms and so on and so forth. So in a sense, what we are trying to do intellectually is to see how we can have a kind of more multi-layered time and space framework to put our people and institutions into, and to see how we do that. And once we can map out those things, then I think we can rethink our categories of East-West connections to South-South connections, to East-East connections, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, we are aiming very ambitiously to think about a paradigm shift, about locality, about region, about nations, and then also about the globe. So different scales, we can be very flexible because precisely we want to deconstruct our own categories through these kind of processes over space, over time, over institutions, and over people. I just thought that I know we have a lot of political scientists here, and bankers and economists, but I really would like to make a plea from the anthropology's side of things, about culture and about rituals, about the kind of cultural capital that we should really think about. I'm fascinated by a big temple in the outside of Guangzhou, for example, that was built in 594 AD. Over the centuries, it's worshipped by all the little ladies in the region. There in the middle of this temple, the chief deity was this dark-skinned, bushy-haired, Tamil-looking man. Right? And this is very much part of the local cultural ethos of worshipping this. And then the temple has a name which is called Boro or something. And it's, according to my friends in South India, actually is a very Tamil term. So in a sense, we will look through rituals, for example, through very much cultural artifacts, we were able to map out all the layers of trade that's connected the Gulf through India and the Indian Ocean, across to the Strait of Malacca, Southeast Asia, and then into southern coast of China. So I mean, these are the kind of connections that we're talking about. But then today, we think about all the trading, the nuances and the distance of trade that connects these communities. But then today, the modern technologies can connect these areas in very different ways. The severing of IP cables off the coast of Africa, or the volcano eruptions in Iceland completely disturb the global stock markets. Now, how do you think about what's being lost in translation when you can transfer billions in a matter of nanoseconds? Right? I mean, all those things, we are still talking about connectivity, but connectivity in a very, very multidisciplinary way. And I think that's the kind of intellectual orientations that I think Satani presented myself. We are really trying to cross humanities, social sciences, business studies, and policy studies in these ways. And in that sense, I think, if there's any level of interest from the Middle Eastern scholars, I think we can definitely connect.
Yes, we'll take one more, and then I'm going to ask Stephanie to sort of wind it up for us. Yes, please.
I just want to talk about some personal experience that maybe would show the problem with the connectivity. Back in Saudi Arabia, I used to work as a journalist in the Hayat newspaper, which is based in Lebanon. And then I was sent to the American University in Lebanon, Beirut, to study investigative journalism with a group of journalists from different countries, from Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and stuff. They were all shocked that there was a Saudi female journalist not covered up and working as a journalist. And they had no background about what's happening in Saudi Arabia and how females are there. So I was quite shocked that our neighboring countries didn't have any background on the social development in Saudi Arabia. I don't know what is the problem, that Saudi Arabia is closed or there's no connectivity between the different countries, which makes it really depressing that Arab countries don't know anything about each other. So how can we think about Asia and how it's connected to the Middle East? So when I moved to Singapore, and I told a lot of my friends and colleagues back in Saudi Arabia that I moved here, they were asking me, oh, how is Indonesia? They thought that Singapore is Indonesia, or they couldn't remember that there's a country called Singapore, which is really depressing because if they don't know the country, how are we going to do research and try to make the different places closer? I also tried to apply for my PhD here and specializing in the Middle East, and I couldn't find any thesis supervisor or professor who has a background in the Middle East here in Singapore. So it was quite shocking. So I hope probably there's we need something like a people-to-people connectivity, maybe programs for people from the Middle East to come here to get to know this area, as well as agents going back to the Middle East. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, those are suggestions we should pay very close attention to, and we will. Michael Feener, I didn't notice. I'll give you the last word, and then Seth.
Okay, well, I want to actually pick up on something that Stephanie started with, which I thought was a very good point, and that the sort of the complete absence of Asian studies in most institutions in our world isn't a result of some deep-seated bias, but simply that people have never thought to look there. And I think that's a really important thing. I mean, if we think comparatively, for example, of the kinds of work that's been done, I think Professor Abhishek did a great job here, sort of looking at some of the main themes that have already been very prolific in scholarship, right? The Hadrami connection, Islamic modernism, Indian Ocean. That sort of came because people working in Asia saw Islam and they thought, for good or ill, oh, Islam, we know that comes from over there. And so they started looking at things going. And I was wondering if we might begin some kind of rubric here. We could begin to pull together a body of scholars who would take up the task of actually looking in the Middle East for where Asia shows up, and to rip off a very good book title, and something like, Asia in the Making of the Middle East, that would look all the way from, say, paper production, right, and how that really transformed Islamic civilization, all the way up to these new knowledge hubs of, Singapore style, migrating to Saudi Arabia and Dubai, right? We have a very long-term project there where everything from, shadow puppets in Cairo to, court arts and popular narrative. I mean, we'd have a very rich, 1,500 years of stuff to work with. The problem would be kind of putting together a framework of scholars working in the Middle East and getting them to realize there might be some of this stuff there if you look. Good point.
Michael? Everybody wants to stop now. Okay, first of all.
Actually, I just wanted to reflect on something, and Mike is already touching on it. First of all, in answer to the question about whether we have Asia in the curriculum, to the best of my knowledge, at AUC, we do not have it in a separate course. We might have it covered in different courses on global political economy and so on. However, what we do have is in the Model Arab League, AUC students had a separate council for Asian affairs. And so students did this before us. What I wanted to what was going in my mind while I was listening to the different ideas, all these ideas about possible directions in research are all good and well. However, what I think we need, I believe in institutional initiatives. What I think we need is a framework that would provide space for this kind of encounter and discussion to go on. And I was thinking in terms of a dialogue. I mean, you have here a clear title, something along the lines becoming a title of a dialogue. And then when Mike threw in the idea of a book, this can be a product actually of it. But I think if we want this to be sustained, we need to think in terms of creating such a framework, an institutional framework for an ongoing work that can begin by just touching on each other's ideas and develop into something. In fact, if I may, one of the possibilities in the different papers, workshop I attended, business was there in a way or the other. One of the possibilities, if there is any interest in attending our next forum in May at AUC and contributing something on Asian business history. I mean, this is a possibility.
Okay, we're running a little over, but yes, please, and then we'll.
Yeah, Michael and our part of professors. See, I'm coming from Indonesia. That's why I like to talk about this. Indonesia, there are more Muslims in Indonesia than all Arabs Muslim together.
Yeah.
You see, it's very important. But I just came back from Europe, and also I realized that people know very little about Indonesia. One of the reasons is because we were not part of the Imperial British or Imperial France. The Dutch. People there do not write, do not speak good English, nor French, you see. That's a problem. But if you look at this, talking about the idea of a cooperation, connection, convergence, look at from the political science, you know. The transformation from 91% of the population is Muslim, you know, from authoritarian regime backed by very strong military for 32 years, you know, that happened in 1998, and became a democratic country in Islamic majority population, could be also source of a comparison. What would happen when changes happen in Muslim majority countries in Arab countries, you see? So when we talk about this cooperation, connection, and convergence, you know, and I just would like to say, do not forget, you know, extend this to Singapore, to the eastern part, which is Indonesia, which is also very important. I know the Indonesian government is very open to support this kind of initiative to Singapore, but also to Middle Eastern countries. And you are very welcome, and extend the connection. That's what I have to say.
Okay, well, thank you. Suddenly, I'm going to give you the chance to tell us what it all means.
Well, as I said, it could only be a beginning, this encounter, but it seems very rich and lots of enthusiasm around the table and actual concrete suggestions as well. So thank you for all. I just want to finish with one idea which relates to what, sorry, was it Nadia said, and maybe a bit also to what Michael said. In our Dubai conference, the Prime Minister of UAE spoke in one of the plenaries, and he said, my father used to look to Bombay and Madras. That's where he'd been educated, he'd spent part of his childhood and so on. He said, for me it was Beirut and Cairo. And for my son, he has an MBA from the States, but I'm sending him to Singapore. So, you know, it's how to capture this, you know, and this change over the generations, but, you know, the return in a new form, new geographies and so on. I mean, how to capture this. And one of the things that I can't find a term for, but for many years as an anthropologist, actually, I've been trying to grapple with as a field of study is something like vernacular imaginations or vernacular geographies or something. I don't know quite what to call it, but what kind of comparisons do people build in their minds when they think about their lives or when they reflect on something in their society? You know, I can't think of only bad examples now. You know, Turks saying, oh no, we're the next Iran, and then, oh no, we're the next Algeria, you know, even worse. You know, that sort of thing. Like, what are these points of comparison that people have and have had in the past? I did a small research project reading the Egyptian paper Al-Ahram from 1910 to 1920, just as the Egyptian constitution was being written. I was interested in how minorities, the debate around minorities and the Copts as a minority and whether they should have a quota in parliament or not. And the references were all to India, in terms of, you know, the British conspiracy to divide and rule and this and that. There was a very dramatic sentence about, let the British laugh, they now have in Egypt a second India, for example. And then in discussions of minority rights, they were saying, you know, Luxembourg, you know, various sort of European examples, and saying we're very different from those kinds of situations. So that's not, I think, what a modern Egyptian political commentator wouldn't make either of those kinds of comparisons now. So I think, you know, I don't know what to call it, I don't know quite how to frame it, but these kinds of points of, it's also one of the great irritants for me ever since I was an undergraduate student, that you read these completely unsupported sentences saying, you know, in the 16th century, you know, Egyptians thought of themselves as primarily Muslim and secondarily, you know, of their village community. And it's like, on what basis, you know, do you know this? I mean, how do you know this? And it's just repeated, or Lebanese thought of themselves as this, you know, and it's always Muslim first, Muslim first. Well, you know, it's possible, of course, but, you know, there's no sort of evidence. And to think that people don't have broader imaginations, I think is very unfair of us. You know, we're the only cosmopolitans, we're the only ones who can think of things more globally. So I agree very much that it's an institutional foundation that can make these ideas and aspirations and so on succeed. It has to be, I mean, since I'm in a non-profit and we fundraise every minute of our lives, you know, to find donors who will have the patience to let something incubate and not demand results right away. You know, I mean, this I think is the challenge, and I think it's more likely to come from sources in the region than from, say, American foundations and so on, who want a problem and they want, you know, to address the problem. It's something. This is very long term work, and so if we can start with these conversations and these institutions around the table to begin to lay the foundations, it almost doesn't matter what the project is about. You know, what thematically what the project is about. It's how it will be constructed, how it will, the process as you described in the case of your center. So thank you again, Michael. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for thinking of us, and thank you for coming over and sharing your thoughts. We certainly benefited a lot from it. I hope it's not the last time that we'll be connected. Thank you very much.